Stephen Bourne, thank you for talking to us. Can you tell us where you got the idea for Fighting Proud from?
I had collected over time snippets and fragments of gay men's lives in the two world wars from various sources, various books over a very long period, and then by sort of around 2012, I approached BBC History magazine about doing an article on gay men's lives in the Second World War, and they readily agreed and commissioned it. That article was read by an editor at a publishing house in London called I.B. Torres, and the editor loved my writing style, contacted me, said, "Can you work this up into a book?" And I said, "Absolutely," and that's how the book commission came about.
What's the book about?
The book is really focused on gay men's lives in the two world wars, whether they be servicemen or on the home front. It's weighted more towards the Second World War because there was less information about the First World War. But really what the book's about is what I think I do best, is the hidden stories. The stories that people don't know about, don't hear about. So I said to the publisher, I don't want to attempt to rewrite the stories of Alan Turing or Lawrence of Arabia or Wilfred Owen, the kind of what I call the iconic figures. I will include them in the book in a section at the end called Not Forgotten, so they're not forgotten. But primarily the book is about the forgotten stories, or not so much forgotten, but the hidden stories that have been marginalised and not highlighted. So it's about men that we've not really acknowledged before.
So are these stories about people who we may not know? Because you do mention Lord Kitchener quite early on.
Well, as I say, it's primarily, but there are exceptions like Lord Kitchener, Noel Coward. They are in the book for personal reasons. I wanted to explore their lives in the First World War and the Second World War. But the main thrust of the book is about men who are not known about. And one of the joys of researching and writing this book for me was rediscovering, or discovering actually for myself, men I'd never heard of. Richard Rumbold, Hector Bolitho, the writer, many gay men's lives that I'd not encountered. And I thought I knew enough for the book. And I did. It was just wonderful to be able to add lots of stories that I didn't know about, and so it was a huge journey of discovery for me.
It's such a broad topic. How do you decide who to include in the book?
Well, in this particular case, it decided itself. It was almost like the book wrote itself. But once, as an author, the way I work, once I set the parameters for the book, once I decided how I wanted to approach the subject, which is to include the iconic figures at the end in a, it's not an appendix, but it's kind of a section called Not Forgotten, then I could focus on the stories that I really wanted to write about. Quentin Crisp, who has been talked about, but I wanted to place him in the context of this book, alongside PC Harry Daly, a police constable who upheld the law while breaking it. During the 1930s and during the London Blitz. So there were lots of stories that lended itself to, and it was easy actually because you're dealing with the war. I just, in the Second World War, separated Army, RAF, Navy, and just highlighted those stories.
You focused on gay men. Why gay men and not, say, lesbians or people who identify as trans?
I wanted to write a book as a gay historian about gay men, or men who identified as gay or homosexual. I could have included the whole LGBT spectrum, but as I explained to my publisher, to do that well and to do it with authority, I'd have to have at least 2 or 3 years and a lot more money, which they were not willing to give because publishers are strapped for cash. So I set the parameters myself. I really, to be honest, I could have included lesbians, but I would have needed more time to do the research, to bring it up to the level of research I've done on gay men. But I really, at heart, wanted to write a gay men's book. Not necessarily for gay men. The book is for everybody. It's a universal book, and I hope people will take it in that spirit. So I think lesbians and bisexuals and transgenders could read it and enjoy it without worrying about the fact that they're not there. I would hope so.
How on earth do you go about researching such a broad topic?
It's much easier to research now. To be honest, in the olden days when I started writing books 25 years ago, of course, one would use the British Library, but I have to confess that I do find the British Library as wonderful a resource as it is. As I get older, I became more and more frustrated with the red tape of trying to access their material, having to trek up there. You have to have an appointment 2 weeks in advance. You have to make sure your membership is renewed. But with Fighting Proud, I discovered I didn't have to use the British Library, because it's all there on the internet. I'm not saying that one should only use the internet for research, because as we all know, there are certain resources on the internet, I'm not going to name them, are factually inaccurate. But in terms of finding books for research, the actual books that someone like Hector Bolitho wrote during the war was easy, because there's always a second-hand bookshop up in Hull that's got a copy for £3. You'd spend more than that trekking up to the British Library. So that's how I did the research. I'd already done masses of research, as I said, over a long period of time, and I just needed to pull all those fragments together. Then to extend the research, with the beauty of eBay and the internet, it's much easier to access the material.
What were some of the biggest challenges writing the book?
I suppose the biggest challenge was making sense of all the information and pulling it together in such a way that it would make sense to me. And I thought, well, if it makes sense to me, hopefully it will make sense to the publisher and they will be happy to publish it. It worked. It worked like a dream because of the structure of the book, which was very simple. I'm not an academic. I don't use words ending in ology. I don't have to beat myself up trying to, like, does this chapter work? Will my thesis examiner understand it, or supervisor, or whatever they're called? I don't work in academia, so I'm free of all that kind of work. I mean, it's a wonderful world to be in if you're in it, I'm sure, but it's not my world. So I structured the book the way that suits me, and I structured it, as I said, by breaking it down in very simple terms in the Second World War, Army, Navy, RAF, and then home front, so that I could include men who were not necessarily servicemen.
Were there any surprises thrown up in your research?
Oh, there were lots of surprises. And that, as I said, this is the beauty of doing this particular book. The surprises, one surprise after another. I knew about Quentin Crispin, PC Harry Daly, and lots of other men in the book, but there were others I knew nothing about. So for me, the joy of doing the book was uncovering these lives, but being given an opportunity to share them so other people can read about Richard Lumford, and who was also known as Richard Rumbold, and who was in the RAF and published a diary. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And Hector Bolitho and all these obscure, Ian Glee, the Battle of Britain fighter pilot, who was twice decorated for his bravery, was killed in action in 1943 at the age of 26. Extraordinary lives that are not in either gay histories or World War I and World War II histories. Because I'm not a military historian, but I have read a lot of books about the Second World War particularly. Less so about the First World War, but I have done some homework. And hardly any of them refer to gay men. Hardly any of them refer to black servicemen. Which is one of my previous books highlighted the black servicemen in the First World War, the Black Poppies book. So it was a voyage. It became something that I wasn't expecting. It became a voyage of discovery. And once I realised I'm going to keep finding out more forgotten or hidden stories, then it became an absolute joy to pull it together.
Why do you think the stories of gay servicemen have been largely ignored until now?
Because we don't take the subject seriously. It's too easy to say, institutional homophobia or homophobia. I think really in the publishing world, there's been a resistance to publishing gay histories. There has been an omission over the last, I would say, 20 years. In the 1990s, there were quite a few lesbian and gay books on the market, and some of them did deal with our histories, and then it all kind of vanished. I've said this in the book. I mean, I've highlighted some of the books that influenced me, but in the past, but in more recent years, in the last decade at least, nothing. And it's very, very sad that there has been this omission, because, and I said to the publisher when we were discussing the contract, I said, let's publish the book in July 2017 to tie in with the 50th anniversary of the Sexual Offences Act, because then hopefully people's consciousness and understanding of our history will be raised a little bit, so we can kind of tap into that and bring the book out at that time. And they thought that was a great idea. But I think the book will, like my Black history books, it will take time for it to be nurtured, to find its way into the world. It does take time. I mean, I'm doing talks, and I've done an interview on Radio 4 that's coming on in August, sorry. But it will take a while for the book to find its readership. But I think it will.
How long did the book take to write?
I started in November 2015 and finished it in November 2016, 1 year really, with a few breaks, and a few trips to the seaside to get a bit of breathing space, but also a few trips to the seaside to revise what I'd written. So early drafts I would take away with me. I'm very lucky to have a friend down at the seaside on the Kent coast that gave me the chance to get away from London and the stresses of living in London, to just read through the drafts, the early drafts, and with a red pen on the seafront with the old ladies in the seafront shelters with my sandwich and my bottle of water or whatever.
A couple more.
I live very simply.
A couple more questions. There's a good mix in the book of positive stories and less positive stories. How important do you think that is?
It's become crucial to my work. I try to explain to people, and it's a very challenging and difficult thing, because we're so much. The narrative of gay men's history is very similar to the narrative of black people's history in Britain. It's about, for black people, it's about racism, the framework of racism. For gay men, it's about the framework of homophobia. What I've discovered for myself over 25 years of writing these books is that isn't the case. And that, again, is a challenge for me as a historian, not to deny racism and homophobia, because of course they did exist and they were dominant in a lot of people's lives, but it's not the whole story. And what I've discovered with Black Poppies, which was published in 2014,
that was about black soldiers.
The black soldiers in the First World War, and what I discovered with Fighting Proud About Gay Men in the First and Second World War, not all white people were racist, not all straight people were homophobic. So there's room in my books for the positive, almost liberating stories, as well as the stories of court-martials and imprisonment in terms of gay men's lives. And that, to me, is very important, to get that balance, because I actually think that it's a liberating thing to read a history book about one's social group, if you like, and discover. It's like if a woman wanted to read about women's history, they don't just want to read about women as victims. They want to read about women who overcame those problems or liberated themselves from those problems and led successful lives. And so people will be surprised that there were gay men in the Second World War who overcame homophobic attitudes by force of personality, by humour.
Do you have any favourite characters or anecdotes in the book?
I've got lots of favourite characters and anecdotes, but particularly the stories that I love the most are, as I've mentioned them already, Hector Bolitho, definitely. I'd love to do more work on him, and the police constable, Harry Daly, because they were just surprising in when I read up on them and did research. There's much more I could do. I think, in terms of discovering their lives, more about them. But yes, that for me was if the book isn't successful, if nobody reads it, at least I've satisfied myself in uncovering stories that I found fascinating and engaging and self-affirming.
Why should people read this book, Fighting Proud?
To get a better understanding of the broader lives of gay men in the two world wars, particularly the Second World War. The First World War was much harsher in its attitudes to homosexuality. We were only a decade or so on from the death of the trial and the death of Oscar Wilde. But by the Second World War, things had changed. It was still difficult for gay men. It was still a criminal offence. But during the duration of the war, as Dudley Cave, the prisoner of war that I include in the book, said, the authorities did turn a blind eye. So there was a more relaxed attitude. But it was also a period in which gay men discovered a sense of self, a sense of their own identity, much more than they'd been able to before. So they knew that the law had to change. And although there was this awful draconian law that led to the witch hunt of the 1950s, once that peaked and things began to settle down, then we move on to the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, the decriminalisation or partial decriminalisation, then the gay liberation, and then so on and so forth until we get up to today. But it's still recent history, and it's extraordinary that these men existed, have never been acknowledged properly. But I hope people will take it in that spirit.
Are there any big lessons you've learned from writing the book?
What I've learned as a historian, and this is not meant to be arrogant, I know how to do it. That's not arrogance, it's just confidence. I was never confident when I started writing books in 1991. I didn't know how to write a book, no one told me. I had to learn on my own. It took years to learn how to do it. I'm not ashamed of any of the books that I've done. I'm very proud of all of them. But with Fighting Proud, it was different. It was like I knew the parameters, I knew the structure, I knew the subject. I learned more as I went along, and I absolutely loved it. It didn't feel like hard work. It was hard work, very hard work. It didn't just fall out of a tree. I had to put a lot of hours and a lot of discipline, self-discipline into it. But it didn't feel like it because I was learning all the time. And I think what I've learned overall is that I can do it. And I just hope I can publish a few more books, before I retire to the seaside.
Any particular projects in the pipeline?
Yes, I'm doing a book now. I've gone straight on to a new contract with another publisher, Jacaranda Books, who are lovely. One of the few, if probably the only black publishing house in this country, which says a lot. But they are absolutely adorable. They're like I call them my Jacaranda family.
Is it a black British book?
It's a black British book, and it's called War to Windrush, and it's to be published next year, 2018, for the 70th anniversaries of Windrush and the birth of the NHS. And the subtitle is a celebration of black women in Britain, 1939 to 1948. So it takes in that 10-year period. It's fascinating. I know the subject, but I know when I write it, I'm going to have so much fun with it, putting it together, and it'll be. I'm going to do it very much in the style of this book, so that it's anecdotal and will appeal, I hope, to a universal readership.
Stephen Bourne, author of Fighting Proud, thank you very much.
You're welcome.